Brought to you by Moonbeam Multimedia.
This is 16 to 1, a podcast about education, teaching, and learning. Good morning.
Hello.
How are you feeling?
Great. How are you?
You sound better.
I am better.
Is your sinus event concluded?
It has concluded.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it has. I feel better. Been outside. Been doing so much professional development.
Yeah. You spent the entire week being very studious. I was impressed.
Yeah. It was hard. It was hard.
You started your science of reading instruction, right?
I did one portion of it.
Is it as
I think
awful?
I have 12 more.
Is it as awful as you anticipated it being?
I'll do a better report once I've finished it.
Yeah.
But so far, it feels like the state of Ohio is like just throwing everything at the wall right now. And it's like, remember this? I think the first section was trying to be like a crash course
In reading?
in trying to remember
language?
all the parts of phonemes and like I think the first section was trying to remind everyone what they had been taught in probably Education 101
Decades ago.
Okay. So it was a little bit overwhelming. Also because this is a class that you take regardless of your content level.
Right.
So it's bridging all kinds of gaps.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what I'm studying right now is not what I will be doing in my classroom.
Is it for like super young learners?
Yes.
Okay.
It is like learning to read. And not that I don't think as an English teacher I should probably know how they're learning to read.
Sure. Yeah, it probably actually is useful for you to have the context that everybody else is going to have too.
Yes.
I suppose. So you'll at least know what your kids were subjected to when they were the youngest learners. Yeah, right.
So I started that. I have a lot to go. So that's going to be my July focus.
Okay. All right.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I've been making progress through my book, my current read that I'm on, The Invisible Women, one that we discussed briefly in our Year in Review episode, and that's been very interesting.
I started reading The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt.
Oh, what's that about?
I'm only 15% of the way.
Okay.
Right now, what I think I can tell you is it's about a young man's discovery of himself after the loss of a parent. I don't want to you know what I mean?
It sounds like a heavy summer read.
It is, but it's been something that a lot of people have told me about. It has been something that I've had students tell me that they loved, and I've had adults tell me that they love.
They recommended the book, the whole book, you mean?
Yes.
Got you.
It was also available on the library app, and during the summer, I just have to take what I can get because everybody else already has all their holds in.
That's
because
true.
They plan ahead and I don't.
It's the summer reading crush.
So I hopefully will have it done by the next time we record, and I will read it appropriately.
I know this is anecdotal, but are you finding it harder to find titles on your library app?
Yes, it's so much harder in the summer.
It's so interesting.
Because I also only listen to audiobooks from Libby.
I mean, it makes perfect sense. Everybody's like going on vacation or road trip, or their kids are out of school and they're doing summer reading goals. It makes a lot of sense that stuff would become more
I also just think that this is when teachers read. I would say a lot of teachers like to read. That's something that many teachers do for fun.
And I'm sure it's so hard during the school year when you're exhausted and crushed by everything else.
I definitely listen to a lot more like nonfiction during the school year because I teach so much fiction.
Oh, I see.
Memoirs, things like that. I always have loved nonfiction anyways.
I know. I've been so in nonfiction. I need to put some whimsy back in my life.
Yeah.
I have a book that we got a couple weeks ago, and it's like on my summer reading to-do list.
Sure.
It's fiction.
What is it?
It's called The Interestings.
The Interestings?
Yes. By Meg Wolitzer. It's about 6 teenagers at a summer camp. And this is the summer the summer that Nixon resigns. I don't know if that's relevant or not, but they have this bond, and then they come kind of like, I think maybe reunite decades later, and they sort of
Oh.
Maybe discuss where they've been and what they've done with their lives.
Kind of the big chillish.
Yeah, it does kind of have that vibe. So
it's a beautiful cover.
It is. It's very pretty.
I need to touch this.
Okay.
Thank you. This is how I understand a book.
Oh,
I have to touch it.
Okay. Anyway.
I actually expected the cover to not feel this way, so that's why I was requesting it. So yeah, the summer is definitely when I can get into more fiction.
I mean, does it require more mental space to get into the reading of a fictional work?
Yes.
Like, do you have to have more kind of working brain available?
Because every time I read a piece of fiction, I'm not reading it to enjoy it. I'm reading it to think, can I teach this? And it's really hard to break that habit.
Ooh.
And I still think about it a lot. Like as soon as I started The Goldfinch, I was like, interesting. And, I'm like putting these thoughts together. But it's much easier in the summer for me to just enjoy it. Because during the school year, I'm always like, oh, what could I do with this?
Interesting.
Shall we get into it?
Yeah, let's get into our education news headline roundup. This is where we talk about the most interesting and compelling headlines from around the world about anything having to do with learning, teaching, leading in schools, other educational organizations. So we'll stick all of our resources in the show notes for these headlines, sources, and links and things like that. You can find those on our website at 16to1.com/archives. Okay.
Around the U.S., some book banning updates.
Oh, joy.
Here we go.
Okay.
From The Guardian, in Florida, a children's book titled Ban This Book by Alan Gratz, which ironically addresses the issue of book banning, was itself banned by the Indian River County School Board. The decision came after a challenge from a local parent who is also the chair of a Moms for Liberty chapter, which is a conservative organization known for advocating book bans.
Yep, we're dealing with this locally.
Next.
Uh-huh.
In Oklahoma.
Yes.
This is from the AP. The state Supreme Court ruled unanimously that local school boards, not the State Board of Education, have the authority to decide which books are available in public school libraries. This decision overturned attempts by the State Board of Education to remove certain books from the Edmond Public Schools library. Additionally, Oklahoma is requiring a copy of the Bible be placed in every classroom, grades 5th through 12th, and for it to be taught. The expectation is that teachers refer to the Bible and the Ten Commandments because of their, quote, substantial influence on our nation's founders and the foundational principles of our Constitution, end quote. For those teachers that are not in compliance, Superintendent of Public Instruction Ryan Walters stated that they could lose their license. Related to the Bible being placed in Oklahoma schools, Louisiana also became the first state to require that the Ten Commandments be displayed in every public school classroom.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. I'm starting to become scared. And to be clear, it's not because I don't think the Bible is an important work to understand and that its influence on our nation's founding isn't important to understand. But I do think that we're verging into quite dangerous territory here with regard to the free practice and expression of religion in our country and protecting the rights of everyone to have or not have religious opinions. Even though I have religious opinions, I still feel it's very important to allow people to come to those opinions on their own in a free way.
Sure.
Let's just say.
One last note about book bannings. The ALA, the American Library Association, reports that the number of titles targeted for censorship surged 65% in 2023 compared to 2022. So the problem is only getting worse.
Yep. I often feel a little bit of a conflict about how much to talk about these things. I feel like it's really important that people know that this is going on at our local school boards. Like, we are dealing with this in our part of the state. This is not just a little one-off thing that is happening with some annoyed people in some parts of the country. Like, this is a pretty widespread, coordinated effort, and it's highly politicized. I often wonder if some of this stuff isn't happening the way it's happening because basically of virality and social media, even the media, like what the media chooses to report on. I'm wondering if these things are happening in part because it's a trend for them to happen. Do you know what I mean? I don't want to draw more attention to it in a bad way, but I do feel that people need to know and be aware. And I think it's happening in some small communities and it's just flying under the radar because people aren't aware that these actions are taking place. So show up at your local school board meetings, ask a lot of questions, find out what your materials review policies are and what they should be, put pressure on local school district leaders to have a plan in place to address book challenges so that classrooms can still be places of learning and curiosity. Second headline. We recently hosted a discussion on legacy admissions, legacy college admissions, and side door donation-motivated college admissions when we talked about the Varsity Blues scandal. That was just episode 106, if you want to go check that out. Now there's a bill that's just been passed by the California State Assembly that may bring financial penalties to private higher education institutions for giving admissions preference to children of alumni and donors. California could join several other states considering or enacting legacy admissions bans. Those other states that are either working on them or have already passed bans include Maryland, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Virginia, and a few others. What do you think about this? We talked about this at the end of that episode. We were like, how is anything going to change unless legacy admissions and donation-based admissions are forbidden?
I mean,
sounds like somebody else agrees with that.
I think somebody else agrees, but I also think some of these schools are going to regret having done it when they don't get the money they think they should have, or from people who said they would and don't, or whatever.
Well, I think that that's just going to mean that the work of advancement officers is going to have to be a little different. You're going to have to work a little harder and differently for your bread in that case if you can't just essentially have a sanctioned bribery scheme in place. Like, maybe that's an okay thing that they're going to have to work to make the case a little, I don't know.
I think there's something there. I also think that we're going to keep hearing a lot of the waffling about this because the amount of students applying to four-year colleges is dropping over time. They might say it now and change it later. Who knows?
Yeah, I'll be curious to see. I mean, it does seem like there's maybe some momentum picking up around this issue.
I think so. Because I'm fine with it, to be clear.
Yeah.
I have no reason to believe that a college isn't going to get money if they want money.
Right.
So that's all.
We did do a pretty deep dive into all of the consequences of admission schemes like this with that Varsity Blues episode, so go check it out if you're interested. But yeah, I think this is, in the long term, going to be a change for the better. We'll see.
Yeah.
Okay, what's our last headline?
The University of Colorado Boulder is retiring remote exam proctoring and monitoring technology, Proctorio, citing low usage after a return to in-person instruction post-COVID-19 pandemic. The university also stated that Proctorio would, quote, remain the recommended provider for online exam proctoring, end quote, across individual departments, despite concerns with Proctorio raised by CU Boulder faculty and students centered around privacy, security, and accessibility. A recent Change.org petition to stop the use of the software at CU Boulder gained more than 1,400 signatures, and CU Boulder is not the first university to experience student pushback. And we actually discussed this in episode 102 about the Union of Students in Ireland.
Yeah, just for those who need a refresher, Proctorio is the software that basically requires you to have, like, I think it's a mic and a webcam set up, and they...
Does one that tracks your eyes?
Yeah, it uses computer vision and the video feed of you and your environment and sound to determine whether or not you're cheating, hypothetically. Right. And there are all kinds of concerns with it. Obvious privacy concerns, I should think, but also concerns about whether it equitably analyzes student behaviors, because some learners have some ways of looking or acting while test taking that Proctorio flags as cheating that is just happens to be how they learn
just
or
human
how they
nature.
Look right.
This episode is about a guy you probably were forced to hear about in an educational psych class.
Yes.
Another one of these guys. We've got to be running out of these dudes eventually. But
for some reason, y'all listen to these episodes on educational psychologists like a lot.
I know. I'm sorry.
Everybody's going to go get a teaching degree.
As far as ed psych people, this guy lived more recently than some.
For sure.
Okay. This is about B.F. Skinner. Just for some context of time, he was born in 1904 and he died in 1990. Skinner was a pioneering American psychologist who significantly shaped the field of behaviorism in the 20th century.
Yes.
Behaviorism is a psychological and or philosophical approach to understanding animal and human behaviors. So generally speaking, it understands behaviors to be consequences of either environmental stimuli or of a subject's personal history of experiences with the observable world. Skinner's work on operant conditioning, which focused on how behavior is influenced by its consequences, revolutionized our understanding of learning and behavior modification.
Yes. We'll talk about operant conditioning a bit more. But
later.
Yeah. But it's basically just like you do something, there's a consequence to what you do that shapes how you do it again the next time.
Let's take it way, way back.
Okay.
March of 1904. Skinner is born in a small town in Pennsylvania. He had a brother who died in his teens, and it was just the two of them and their parents, and they described their home as warm and stable.
Okay, I will just note that in the biographies of all of these famous ed psych dudes, you always have to describe the home life because a lot of people... Turns out, a lot of people end up asking questions about, like, how exactly is it that you got into this and why exactly is it that you think that people work this way? So, anyway, okay.
So
stable, normal home life, apparently.
Warm and stable,
okay.
Direct quote. Their dad was a lawyer. Their mom was a housewife. And Skinner, even from a young age, liked to create and liked to build things.
Oh, same BF.
Yeah. He attended Hamilton College and decided that he wanted to become a writer. That was his first plan.
Okay.
After he completed college, he moved back home for some time, and he didn't write a lot during this time. And this time period in his life became known as the dark year. Yeah. I would like to live such an interesting life that I could be like, oh, yes, my dark year.
I mean, maybe he just felt it was dark because he was a newly minted college student who had to move back in with his parents?
Yeah, I think he was just trying to make his way. He's probably going through some grief still of losing his brother.
Okay.
So he has his dark year. During his dark year, he actually didn't write that much. It was like a dozen short newspaper articles. And so he took off for New York City and worked at a bookstore. That work at the bookstore, which I love. I love the idea of leaving Pennsylvania to like live your dream and you end up in New York City working at a bookstore. Like that is my dream as well. He's working at a bookstore. And while there, he is introduced to books by Pavlov and Watson. Pavlov, we all know, or at least his name, we probably know. Pavlov focused on classical conditioning. And
he's the guy with the dogs and the mouth watering, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So Pavlov demonstrated that animals could be conditioned to produce reflexive responses to some kind of stimuli through repeated association. This was very important to Skinner, the work of Pavlov.
Yes.
Okay. So Watson was a major proponent of the shifting psychology focus from the mind to observable behavior, which became known as behaviorism.
Yeah.
He believed that objective analysis of the mind, like Freud, was impossible, and instead preferred to focus directly on observable behavior and how to control it. So because of this interest in the work of Pavlov and Watson, Skinner actually, at age 24, decides to enroll at Harvard, and he's going to focus on psychology.
Okay, so he's a little bit slightly older student when he gets to Harvard.
He had some gap year time, yeah.
Those dark years.
Yeah, I mean, he'd already completed one degree.
I see.
So this is kind of like I don't know if it'd be considered a master's route or if he was just going back to school for the fun of it. I don't know what it would have been considered then, but he goes to Harvard.
Okay.
While at Harvard, Skinner is allowed the freedom to research and to experiment as he wants. He gets to push against what he had learned from Pavlov and Watson, and he focuses his research on rats and their behaviors and the consequences of those behaviors.
Yeah.
Skinner also worked with pigeons and other things later, but he started at Harvard with rats.
Interesting.
So he graduates from Harvard in 1931. He stayed there and just did research and was writing until 1936. In 1936, he accepts a position at the University of Minnesota. And then in 1945, he goes to Indiana University, where he served as the chair of their psychology department. And then in 1948, he returned to Harvard as a tenured professor, and he stayed there the rest of his life. He was deeply entrenched in Harvard and is most known for his work at Harvard.
But a Harvard boy.
A little bit about him personally before we jumped into more of his theories. He had a wife, Eve. He had two daughters, Julie and Debbie. A 1945 article in Ladies' Home Journal about a crib that Skinner constructed for his daughter, Deborah, created the persistent rumor that he experimented on his wife and children. It was called the baby tender.
Did you? I went and looked up a photo of this thing.
Looks like the Skinner box.
He didn't like the name Skinner box, I learned, but he invented this device that was used in operant conditioning experiments called the Skinner box, and people saw this magazine spread and were like, that's a Skinner box. And it's not. He made this special crib for his daughter that supposedly...
His wife requested him to make.
Yeah. That supposedly kept her comfortable in harsher Minnesota winter conditions.
And
it had like warming involved in it. There's like a warming mechanism. Anyway, it's a little odd.
But he did not do any of these types of trials or experiments on his daughters. It was not
an operant conditioning chamber.
My understanding of the Skinner daughters is that they really didn't seem to be too hung up on who their dad was or anything like that. Like,
sure, we have to contrast it with other psychologists at the time.
Who did.
We even talked about this in our Piaget episode. He, in fact, did experiment on his family.
Oh, Piaget, this guy.
So, yeah, Piaget did run research and experiment on his family. And then also, John B. Watson, the guy who influenced Skinner or his early research days, he ran this experiment on a baby. I think he was Little Albert experiment. Have you heard of this? It was basically... I don't know if it was operant conditioning, but it was some sort of conditioning that was done to a baby. Obviously, the baby not being able to give consent to participating in this experiment, but it was conditioning done to a baby to make them I think it was to make them afraid of furry creatures or something. And they didn't decondition the baby after running the
experiment. I do remember this now.
So anyway, that's happening in and around this time frame of research on behaviorism and conditioning. Yeah. And so I think that some of this chatter about whether or not Skinner experimented on his family was probably because other people at that time were running dubiously ethical experiments, sometimes on babies, sometimes on their family members. And Skinner wanted to somewhat distance himself from those conversations. He's like,
rightfully so.
Hey, I'm doing research, but I'm not doing that. Let's just talk about some of his theories, concepts, random weird projects. We should, of course, start with the concept of operant conditioning. In operant conditioning, and I'll just grab the WebMD definition here, it's the results of your past behaviors have conditioned you to either repeat or avoid certain behaviors. For example, parents will reward you for getting an A on a test, and that if that requires you to study hard, and then as a result, you're going to be more likely to study hard in the future because you're anticipating more reward. It's kind of along the same lines as positive and negative reinforcement. As we just mentioned, he also contributes to the field this idea of the Skinner box, also known as the operant conditioning chamber. He didn't like it to be called the Skinner box. Maybe it's because it involves doing unpleasant things to animals and he doesn't want to have it named after him.
Maybe.
I guess. It's a laboratory apparatus designed to study animal behavior and learning through operant conditioning. There's usually some sort of lever or bar or key that an animal can interact with or manipulate. When a lever is pressed, food or water or some sort of other type of reinforcement gets dispensed to the animal, and the animal will eventually change its behavior based on some sort of schedule or way of receiving the reinforcement. You had a fun note in here about...
Did I?
One of his other weird random projects. Do you want to talk about this?
No.
You researched this a little bit.
Okay. It's World War II.
Yeah.
Cut to why I had to start researching Project Pigeon. So, my understanding of Project Pigeon is that Skinner created the top secret project to train pigeons to guide bombs. These pigeons would be trained to peck a target that would guide a missile to whatever the target is.
Yeah, you have to understand the context here.
I would have to understand a lot of things to understand why war pigeons were something we were considering.
War pigeons. Yes. Okay, well, it's pre-radar, right?
Well, yeah, and that's the funny part about Project Pigeon is that this project was discontinued and never fully realized because they were developing radar secretly and Skinner didn't know that. So he was just like with a flock of pigeons.
Just out here having a good time with some pigeons.
I love the idea that this guy is like, pigeons, go. And meanwhile, the government is like, radar. He worked really hard on the pigeons, but it never took flight. You're welcome. The pigeons are going to die also. I think this has to be included. Like, these pigeons don't get to fly away safely. They don't get to come back to their families. They're dead.
They're like part of the machinery of war in this research scenario.
They're on top of a bomb. Which will then lead us to victory.
You can see why people started asking questions about the ethics of these experiments.
Well, the one thing that this did teach Skinner, though, is that pigeons behave really rapidly and are much easier to work with. And so actually after that, he never returned to working with rats. So way to go, pigeons.
Okay, so he fell in love with pigeons. Okay.
Fell in love with, that's a big comment. Okay, Skinner, well, you can't defend yourself.
Experimentation.
So here we go.
Not in a weird way, just in an experimental way.
The reason you might be listening to this is because you're curious about his impact on education.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk about some of his theories of learning.
So his brand of behaviorism emphasizes the role of reinforcement and punishment into shaping whatever behavior you're hoping for.
It is difficult to understate the influence of the behaviorists on modern classrooms.
That was my next point. So good job.
Okay, sorry.
Essentially, the thought is that individuals learn through the consequences of their action, right? Mm-hmm. My personal belief, I guess I am into this because I would say that without reinforcements, classrooms can't exist, or healthy ones can't. This is the basis for a classroom's rules and expectations and interactions. The whole profession is built upon rewarding behavior in hopes that it continues and to build a system that encourages students to behave in the way that is most productive to a learning environment, right? So yeah, I think I believe that that's true.
Do you think it should be true, or do you think it is true now?
I'm going to guess the answer should be that it doesn't have to be, but that it is.
Well, we'll talk more about it at the end, but I think that we're going to see this contrasted with, for example, that book that we've talked about a couple of times now, that Punished by Rewards book by Alfie Kohn. He's essentially critiquing the behaviorist approach to motivating behavior by saying actually setting students up to expect rewards is not necessarily the way to motivate them to be self-led learners in the long run. Let's throw in a couple of other theories of learning that Skinner brought us. He had some interesting thoughts about language acquisition. He, of course, thinks it emerges from operant conditioning. So language learning is largely based in imitation. And figures like Noam Chomsky famously critiqued this and did not like this. They're like, no, this is way overly simplistic for how we understand. You know, this is not an adequate explanation for how young learners acquire language.
Sure.
Skinner also doesn't really think that we think in the traditional sense of that word. He thinks that like thoughts, emotions, and actions are products of our environment and our response to them. We usually think of thinking as this process that I do internally in my own mind about stuff, and I have free will to kind of direct my own thinking. He's like, no. Your thinking is also a more complicated, but still a byproduct of your environmental stimuli and your history of interacting with your environment.
Sure.
So let's talk a little bit about the application of Skinner's theories in educational settings and just go through some examples of behaviorist techniques in the classroom. So like you were talking about, positive reinforcement, using praise, rewards, or privileges to encourage desired behaviors and academic performance. Verbal praise or stickers or extra credit. You're talking about how you think that that's an important tool in your classroom.
Yeah, I do. I think I do think it's important. I think that's the way that everybody builds trust.
Is by receiving reinforcement.
I think that trust is what you receive by doing the things you're expected to do. So, like, if everyone, in my case, you know, for high schoolers, like, my students who say they have the most fun are the students that I've built the most trust with because they have proven to me that they can handle XYZ. Whereas the classes that struggle with me the most are usually the groups that I have the hardest time reaching, or that I spend the most time dealing with their behavior or whatever issues in the classroom. And so, like, even this past year, I had 3 different classes of the same class, like 3 different periods. And 2 of them, we had a really great time. And I guess they would say that nice things to my face, at least, about their experience. In the 3rd group, I just never I just never broke through to them. I was never able to reach them.
The way you talk about the differences in your classes that way and how it's kind of like random, it's sort of luck of the draw about that vibe. The closest analogy I can think of, not having had classrooms of high schoolers myself, is like being on stage doing a performance and you'll have a crowd that reacts really well. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like the house will be really good tonight and you'll be on and they'll be like laughing when they're supposed to laugh and you'll be playing off of their energy. But then you can have a totally dead crowd where for whatever reason, it just feels like everybody has agreed not to cooperate with you as a performer in that case.
Yeah, that's how it feels for sure.
Is that how it is? Where it's just like, what is happening that you have no humor?
I think there are so many factors in it too, but yeah, I think that there's a lot to be said for that. You have to be willing as a student to put your guard down and to let things, you know, sort of transpire and occur. And sometimes they're not. And that's for all kinds of reasons. Also, sometimes people just don't mesh, and that's okay too. So other things from his theories, immediate feedback, right?
Yes.
Like teachers providing quick responses to student work or behavior, which can reinforce correct answers or appropriate conduct promptly, right? If it needs to.
The immediacy is the important part that kind of comes out of some of the operant conditioning experiments. It's like, if you provide feedback that happens like a day later, Skinner was like, well, if you give them the feedback the next day, it's not going to make as much of an impact. The operant conditioning isn't conditioning as hard if the response comes in any kind of delayed way.
Got you.
Token economies. Students will earn tokens or points or some other something or other for good behavior or academic achievement, which can be exchanged for rewards. We had a bustling token economy in my 4th grade classroom in elementary school. I remember this so distinctly. This was a very involved system. We would have competitions among the class to design the bills, 1s and 5s, for this token economy. That whole thing felt weird to me even at the time. I'm not going to lie. It felt like a real weird system of haves and have-nots very obviously at work in the 4th grade classroom. And it's just like so much time and attention was paid to this token economy. It was straight up weird. It was really weird.
Interesting.
But I don't know why I felt so weird about it at the time, but even now looking back on it, I could remember how the token economy made me feel
interesting
in 4th grade. So anyway, okay. Behavior modification.
Yeah.
Just generally speaking, teachers will use behavior modification techniques to shape student behavior. Programmed instruction. This is starting to sound a little iffy to me, but there's some educational software and online learning programs that will use principles of programmed instruction. So programmed instruction is like breaking down content into smaller chunks that are more manageable and giving immediate feedback on them. So you've talked about using MemBeam before, which is a vocabulary.
What did you mean by this sounds iffy?
Well,
what does that mean?
I think
like teachers shouldn't be using them?
I'm not saying that. It's just that I have a lot of open questions about behavior modification techniques and whether or not that's the sort of learning that we should be or want to be doing. Because there's a question about honoring a student's agency in all of this. And
so what does MemBeam do to not allow a student agency?
Well, it's sort of, I mean, I don't know the specifics of MemBeam, so this is not a critique of MemBeam specifically, but the reason I mentioned MemBeam was just because I know it kind of provides more or less immediate feedback and it breaks down learning into bite-sized chunks. I have some question marks about whether behavior modification should be used to encourage or motivate learning. And this is because of this issue of agency. Like, do we feel okay with treating human beings like they are in Skinner boxes and we are just kind of programming beep boop input and response? That's the questionably ethical part of a Skinnerian approach to education, I think. The last two here are like consistent consequences. So we need to have like clear rules and consistent consequences for both positive and negative behaviors, because if you don't have that, learning can feel very chaotic and unfair. Yeah. And then study habits. Teachers might use behaviorist principles to encourage certain kinds of study habits. So like providing rewards for the use of more effective learning strategies, stuff like that.
I'm going to have to read more into the agency of these things.
Well, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's talk about some criticisms of Skinnerian theories. So there might be an overemphasis on observable behavior at the exclusion of internal processes. There are a lot of people who think that Skinner, especially in educational context, fails to account for cognitive processes, emotions, social factors in learning. They're like, no, social emotional learning is actually a thing, and whether or not you can observe it or quantify it or measure it very precisely, it is still happening. Okay. And we can't just explain away all behavior as like stimulus response.
Yeah, so that makes sense.
Yep. It's a very deterministic way of understanding human behavior that is in conflict with individual agency. So if we reduce everything down to stimulus response, where does that leave room for you to have a mind of your own and make your own decisions?
Okay.
And then, obviously, this is what we're already talking about, but there is perhaps an over-reliance on dubiously ethical behavior modification techniques, and definitely a potential to verge into social engineering or manipulation. These techniques tend to, from a high level, prioritize compliance over critical thinking.
Just encouraging them to behave and do their work and whatever, instead of actually, pushing past that?
Yeah, so like a punishment reward system is very much designed to elicit an expected response, and there's not much care given there into anybody's will or whatever. I mean, this is where I get squishy about Skinnerian principles, because I mean, you can see where very quickly this kind of stuff can become dangerous if you turn over the power of this stuff to like a marketer. For example, marketing uses behavior modification, and like social media also uses behavior modification techniques. Surveillance Capitalism book I also talked about last episode. A lot of that book was talking about Skinner's influence on modern technology and those companies, and how they are using principles of operant conditioning to not only like understand but also change human behavior. It can get really scary because we are human animals, which means we do react like the lab rats and the pigeons react to operant conditioning. But we also like to think of ourselves as beings with free will and agency. And
can't both be true.
Well, not if you're Skinner. He's pretty much a hardliner on no, all of this gets reduced down to stimulus response.
Okay.
There's also a pretty complicated history with operant conditioning in psychology. It's been used to do things like treat phobias and addictions, which you can see like, oh, okay, well, that might help somebody. But then it's also been used to, quote unquote, treat things like autism and homosexuality. Oh, that's the part where this stuff can...
bad.
Yeah, this is where we can get into manipulation.
Sure.
We have to be extremely careful with behavior modification techniques to realize that we're driving people toward a certain set of behaviors that may or may not be ethical to do.
I'm just going to throw this out there. My kids are not so easily swayed to behave in any sort of way that I hope that they will. So I think we're okay.
The operant conditioning is not so operant.
It doesn't matter how strong it is. The reward is it's not going to...
Okay.
I don't think we're too far into it yet. Maybe someday we'll just be a bunch of yes men, but we're not yet.
Well, I mean, I do think there is the broader question to ask about whether a whole system that's based on like punishment and reward is ultimately the way we want to have our systems of education constructed.
Sure.
I think. But.
Okay.
So anyway, he's also made a mark on educational technology. So in the 1950s, even as early as then, he was working on teaching machines, which were mechanical devices designed to provide programmed instruction to students. So it seems like remarkably commonplace now. Like, why would this even be a...
Yeah, back then that would have been...
Right. In the 1950s, though, it seemed noteworthy. So these machines would break down complex tasks into smaller steps. They'd provide immediate feedback, and they would allow students to progress at their own pace, which Skinner also thought was very important. The immediacy of feedback and pace learning made their way into the design of everyday educational technology now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Seems reasonable. Lots to think about.
I've just got a few questions, and you can riff on these as a classroom educator.
I would love to.
Do you think that Skinner's focus on observable and measurable behaviors has had an overall positive or negative impact on formal education systems? the de-emphasis of the internal states of a person.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I think teachers do both. I think teachers are able to focus on observable and measurable behaviors, right? And use those to help us be informed about someone. But I also think that teachers are able to look at students and see them as an individual with whatever going on. So I think it's a little bit of both. Can that be? Can I say both?
No, I think that for example, you've described scenarios where if a lot of people in your class don't do well on a quiz, that's a way of like looking at the observable and measurable to say, hey, something is not working.
Something didn't
here.
go well. Yeah.
Right. But then you also, I know, form very respectful and interesting relationships with students based on their internal states. Like if a student comes to you with a problem or a question or a difficult like family issue, which is stuff that happens all the time in schools, you're not just thinking of them as like a stimulus response machine. You're honoring their social emotional state.
Yeah. This is such a individualized question, right? Because any teacher answering it would probably feel something about it. I feel like I have a good mix of it all as far as measurable behaviors, right? Or observable behaviors, but then also knowing that this is a individual with whatever going on, whoever they may be, whatever. So I think overall, probably negative because people have relied too heavily on the observable and measurable.
It can become an end in itself, and then it's like a self-defeating system.
Yeah, I would say probably overall negative, but I think that I'm going to just like toot my own horn. I think I have a good mix of it.
Okay.
But I don't think all teachers do. And I think it could go either way, way too far, right? Is that fair?
Okay, sure.
Is there a right answer? Is he going to find me?
Skinner?
I hope not.
Well, he died when the year you were born, so I'm going to go with no.
What if I'm Skinner?
You're the reincarnated
What if I was
Burris
Skinner?
Frederick.
It's me, Burris.
Okay, so here's the next question. This is already what I'm asking kind of in various places. But how much behavior modification is too much in the field of education? The reason I'm asking this is because you've even raised concerns along these lines. You said in previous episodes that students are only doing stuff to get a grade at the end, and they don't care about their learning. They only care about their grade.
Yes.
That suggests to me that operant conditioning is doing a disservice to students.
Yeah, I would agree.
So are you revising your earlier statement about how classrooms have to run on operant conditioning?
Okay, but like, yes and no.
I know.
Because it's not yes and no. It's still yes and no for me. It's not one or the other.
Okay.
It's still not. Because earlier what I was talking about and referencing was like, the kids who buy into me, I buy into them, right? That's an aspect of what he's talking about. Those opportunities make a better or worse learning environment for people, right?
I get that. What can I hold on a second? Because what do you mean by buying in? Because I don't think that I know what you're talking about like a mechanism of building trust in the classroom. Why do you think that something like operant conditioning, some flavor of operant conditioning is the way to do that? Because I totally agree with you that like building a trusting relationship in the classroom is important.
Okay, here's what I would say.
Uh-huh.
And this is again from last year, because I had these 3 very distinct groups of learners throughout my day. My last period class was the class I was furthest from. Physically, emotionally, mentally, all of it. Okay. We were not a great match for as a whole.
We didn't vibe.
Some of those students I really clicked or didn't click with. And so I would hear from that class a lot like, oh, I heard you did this activity in the other classes. Why don't we do it? And it's because my other 2 classes I trusted to work with me, and they trusted me to get us through it.
Sure.
More than what I had established and created. And probably a lot of what happened with 7th period was my own fault. But
you're getting this like haunted look in your eyes when you're thinking back on this, by the way. And I know that educators feel this. They're like, oh, the ones that got away. Like the ones that I couldn't reach.
They very much are.
Well, I understand that. They're like things that you can do with certain groups of learners that you can't do with others.
But 7th period would be disappointed. Because their class, I often treated them like a separate kind of prep. Because they couldn't always do exactly what the other classes were doing. But then they would hear that from their friends and be like, well, why can't we have fun? Or why can't we do this? Or why can't whatever? Those opportunities, like, we never built those together. And it wasn't just them. Again, like, I'm going to put a lot of this on me too. They were aware that they weren't having the same experience, and they wanted to do the same things that the other classes were doing because they heard the other classes were having fun.
Right. So doesn't that suggest that compliance is not the way to motivate behavior in that case? Operant conditioning is not working for this group of learners.
No, it wasn't.
Well, why do you... So you think that it's working for the other groups of learners because they're doing what you want them to do?
No.
Okay.
Not because they're doing what I want them to do, but because they were willing to try to do something. I couldn't get them to say anything to me so that I could try to make it into something for them.
I get it. And it sounds to me like compliance isn't and shouldn't be the goal. Compliance is just the means by which the goal can be achieved for certain groups of learners.
I agree.
But you're saying, okay, what the goal actually is self-motivated curiosity.
Sure.
And you can lean into it in a group where it's already more present, and it's more difficult with the group where you feel like you have to. So the issue is, how do you develop the curiosity if it's not already there?
Well, and that's what was hard, was because the other two classes loved that unit. They loved reading poetry. They wished we had done more. And the last class hated it. It was their least favorite thing we did all year. I could get almost 60 learners right into it with me after a little poking and prodding, of course.
Okay, well, yeah. I mean, that's the question. How do you think that behavior modification techniques played into that difference?
I would say they didn't, because it never worked for me.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, that suggests...
Maybe I should have brought in treats to make them work for them.
Well...
Put them in a little Skinner box and...
I mean, it suggests that that's a failure of operant conditioning to produce what you want. So, I think, and this is, a common critique of Skinner, is that there are perhaps more ethical ways of motivating the behavior that you want. And I guess the other thing is the behavior that you want. That whole equation is kind of part of the problem, right? Because you've predetermined what successful behavior looks like, and you're trying to get your students to just do it.
But being a teacher is to have goals to work towards. So getting them to do what I want is not just some flippant thought of what I think they should do with Maya Angelou. It's actually addressing the standards of learning for which I'm being held to because I have a professional degree. So yes and no. I don't know that we can boil it all the way down, because inherently education is or isn't this in some way all the time.
Yeah. When you have goals that you
I have to do things. Right. I can't just do it because of the vibes. Sorry, kids, that's not an option.
Well, let me just say, though, that I think I have the same criticisms for other kinds of work environments. Corporate jobs in America are also very much based in operant conditioning, where it's punishment for doing things bad, reward for doing things good. And I think I'm critiquing maybe that entire approach everywhere. So you are held to account in your job similarly. I think the question is whether or not that is really the best way to, in the long term, motivate people to,
I would say,
be productive or contributors to society or whatever. Yeah. Extrinsic reward might not be the best way to get things done.
I mean, but I'm the same way, right? I go to work, I get paid. So I keep going to work because I keep getting paid. That's the lever in my Skinner box. Payday. Isn't that the whole rat race?
Yeah, but I guess I would also say that it's not, because you and I have spoken frequently about pay is obviously motivating in one sense, in that sort of in the drudgery of day-to-day work, it'll get you to go to your job, but you also do an incredibly difficult job where the pay, I don't think, is scaled to the appropriateness of the...
No, but I certainly wouldn't do it for free.
Right. But I mean, many
teachers... other rewards.
Sure.
I have other rewards.
And you think that's why... You think that you are a teacher because of those intangible rewards.
There would be no other reason to do it.
Well, why do
the pay isn't that good?
I guess I'm not sure that I conceive of that as a reward. I don't think that
those connections and relationships and the feeling of being in a classroom and having kids trust you and love you and support you, and you get through things and you talk about things and you can see change in them. There's no better reward than that.
But that's not a reward, because there's not some agent in the universe deciding, here is the experiment and here is the reward that you get for the experiment. Like, that's not a reward. That's not a transactional thing. That's just the nature. That's what's compelling about the nature of education to me. It might
be the reward is that I get to be the one to do it.
Yeah. And I'm sure
I'm in the classroom. That's the reward. I'm in the place where it happens.
I don't mean that it's not a rewarding experience for you. I just mean, I don't know that I would categorize that as a reward in the Skinnerian sense, because it's not like somebody has set up this experiment where you go into a box and you get out this feeling of connection with students. So I'm saying we might be doing ourselves a disservice to think of everything in terms of punishment and reward, as opposed to just like, this is like what human flourishing looks like. Like, this is what we're supposed to be feeling like when things are going well. Getting outside of a system of punishment and reward and not putting everything in those terms might be healthier for us in the long run, is all I'm trying to say.
Okay.
But I understand what you're saying. Like, it feels rewarding. I don't think of those things that you're talking about that you get out of education as being these like extrinsic rewards in the way that these other operant conditioning systems have.
I think it's a reward because not every teacher gets them. Not every teacher has those moments. Not every teacher feels those things. Not every teacher builds those relationships or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the reward of it, is that in addition to accomplishing whatever the goals are as prescribed by the state of Ohio, there are so many other really wonderful things that I get from it. I'm glad to be paid. Don't get me wrong. Like, I wouldn't be doing it if it was only for the pay. Trust me. Like, there are so many other things that make teaching worth it. Mm-hmm. Those are the rewards. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I think I'm just thinking of those things that you're describing as intangibles. Like, I don't think that Skinner would give a fig about those things you're describing because they're about your internal state.
Right. And he wouldn't. But if I'm applying the thought of the reward, right, which was like the key for some of this behaviorism, because that's what encourages you to do or not to do something, right? It's the vibe. The vibe is the reward.
The vibe.
And he can't measure that. It's hard to describe to someone who isn't a teacher what it feels like. Mm-hmm. There are moments when I'm sitting there and I am like, oh my God, this is my life. What a cool time I'm having. And there are times that I'm bashing my head on my desk crying. There is no middle. And the days where I feel the most successful, I have nothing to show for it. That's what's hard sometimes, is because that isn't the definition of success, right? Success is a thing.
I think we're actually saying similar things. You're saying that there's like this lightning in a bottle that you can sometimes capture that doesn't really track to.
No.
Like, it's not like a operant conditioning chamber where you can like stick in a stimulus and get a response.
Right.
It's not, there's not a one-to-one in like expecting a certain outcome in your students based on what you're putting into it. Like, I've heard you say sometimes the things that you prepare for the most intensely and spend weeks and weeks getting ready to do, sometimes
the things I hate the most.
Right. They just fail, or at least they seem to you to not reach students. And then the thing that you've like thrown together right before you walk into the classroom that day for whatever reason is the thing that is wildly successful in reaching students. So that to me suggests that the operant conditioning principle is too simplistic, that there is something about education that is more or less magic.
I agree.
I'm just saying, I think you're selling yourself short to just call yourself a product of operant conditioning in that sense. I don't think that the reward that you're talking about can be quantified in Skinnerian terms.
That's fair.
I think that you are far more tuned into the internal states of your learners in a way that Skinner never would be, because it's not quantifiable and not measurable. This goes back to like our standardized testing conversation. The same thing was happening there, like punishment, reward, score for your whatever, achievement, reduce it to a number. And that just doesn't really work to motivate the kind of learning that you're most interested in motivating, which is the self-directed lifetime curiosity. That's what you're aiming for.
Yeah.
And those kinds of connections require way more subtlety than the Skinner box is able to provide.
I agree. Fill in the blank.
Fill in the blank.
You write in and tell us the answer. We send you stickers.
hello@16to1.com is our email address. We would love to hear from you for the trivia question. And yeah, we'd love to send you stickers. Okay.
Last episode's question. the Tony Awards had just happened. Okay. Mm-hmm. So the Tony Awards were awarded for the first time in 1947. And since 1947, Hamilton has been nominated for the most Tony noms of all time, total of 16. The Producers has won the most Tonys with 12. Who are the Tonys named for? They are named for Antoinette Tony Perry. She was an American actress, a producer, a director, and administrator known for her work in the theater, and she was the co-founder and secretary of the American Theater Wing.
Yes.
Antoinette Tony Perry. What you got this week?
This episode's question: most people are likely to think that Pavlov won his Nobel Prize for his work with dogs and understanding of their trained responses, but this was not what caused him to win his Nobel Prize. For what did Pavlov win the Nobel Prize? Okay, and then you want to talk about what we learned?
Yeah, what'd you learn?
I learned about Microsoft Outlook.
Okay.
In 1999, way back in the day, hackers revealed a security flaw in Hotmail. And when we were kids, everybody had a Hotmail account. It was like the free, I still have a Hotmail account. It's the free email address accounts at the time.
I can't even imagine what happened to that account.
Yeah.
I have a Yahoo account floating in the world somewhere.
A Yahoo account. Okay.
I'll never tell you what the name of that account was. But
I'm sure it's embarrassing.
It is.
Mine are all embarrassing. Okay, so in 99, hackers revealed a security flaw in Hotmail that permitted anybody to log into any Hotmail account using the password EH, just 2 letters, EH. At the time, I'm reading from the Wikipedia entry here. At the time, it was called the most widespread security incident in the history of the web.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
So there was also another incident in 2001 with Hotmail where anybody who logged in could pull messages from another Hotmail account by like changing the URL with a second and using the second account's username. Millions of accounts were exposed through these vulnerabilities. But yeah, the one with the password of was the funniest one to me.
I love it.
Yeah, I didn't know that. So basically just like any Hotmail account could have been hacked. Yeah, most widespread security incident in the history of the web.
Did they like set it as a joke and forget? Or was it
usually the way those things work is there's some sort of back door that's used for mostly testing purposes where it's like, you just want to be able to test something. So you log into anything with this default account. But somebody discovered that vulnerability and
that's funny.
Yeah.
Okay.
So how about you? What did you learn?
This is on brand.
Oh, okay.
For this episode.
Okay.
As I was researching for the fill in the blank, I was reading about Pavlov. I learned that he worked with all kinds of dogs. He didn't have a set breed that he would work with to train. And he usually actually used mutts. He liked mutts a lot.
Oh, okay.
So he actually really did love those dogs, and they all had names. But I was expecting Pavlov to like have a breed, or you know what I mean? Like I just expected him to have like a very rigid sort of.
For some reason, I always pictured German shepherds.
I know. I think I expected like a shepherd too.
I think it's because those dogs look scary when they salivate, and that's what I meant. Like, you know, he did all those experiments on bells and drooling or whatever. Mm-hmm.
So he actually preferred mutts, and he had some favorites.
Oh boy. Well. Okay.
So, yeah, that's a little bit more about Pavlov.
Okay.
I'm going to be thinking about what I'm doing in my classroom for a while now, so I need a moment. I need to go lay in the pool and ponder what I'm doing with my life.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you again in another 2 weeks.
See ya.
Bye. Hey listeners, thanks for supporting 16 to 1. We're your co-hosts. I'm Chelsea Adams.
And I'm Katie Day. Find our show notes, archives, and resources, sign up for our newsletter, or get in touch with us via the contact form at 16to1.com, all spelled out.
We are so grateful for our listener support. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the show and telling your friends or colleagues about it.
The show is edited and produced by you, Chelsea Adams, and you're also responsible for our show's music.
And you, Katie Day, serve as lead researcher and social media manager.
Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next show. So this episode,
yes,
is about Behaviorism.
Excuse me?
Behaviorism Frederick Skinner.
I heard that people call him Fred, and I can see why now.